Free Radio Hour is brought to you by Baen Books Audio Drama, presenting dramatized audio plays of the best science fiction and fantasy with a professional cast and cinema-quality soundtracks. Now available, Eric Flint's Islands, based on the novella by Eric Flint. Also available, Larry Correia's Detroit Christmas, based on the novella by Larry Correia, set in the world of the Grim Noir Chronicles at BaenEbooks.com. Just put Islands and Detroit Christmas in the search bar and enter a world of listening pleasure. Baen Books Audio Drama.
The Baen Free Radio Hour.
Today on the podcast, we get down in the trenches and soar to the stars with the contributors of the year's best military science fiction and space opera. And we begin our serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky. All that right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. Attentive listeners will have picked up by now that I am not Baen editor Tony Daniel. I'm David Afsharirad, and if you're a regular listener to the podcast, you might recognize my voice. Tony's away from the Baen studios this week, but we'll be back to the program soon. In the meantime, it's a pleasure for me to be here with you. Today we're talking to five contributors to the new anthology, out now and available from booksellers everywhere, the year's best military science fiction and space opera. We've got Matthew Johnson, Derek Kunsken, David D. Levine, Linda Nagata, and Michael Z. Williamson on deck. And as a bonus, we're throwing in the editor of year's best military science fiction and space opera. That would be me, David Afsharirad. After that, we have the first entry in our complete audiobook serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky. But first, here's the news. June trade paperbacks, we've got 'em. Hot off the presses and for your reading pleasure. First up, Multiverse, exploring the worlds of Poul Anderson. Anderson was one of the seminal figures of 20th century science fiction. Equally at home in fantasy and SF, Anderson left a legacy that continues undiminished to this day. Multiverse, which was edited by Greg Bear and Gardner Dozois, pays tribute to this Sefwa Grand Master. It's chock full of good stuff, essays and remembrances, as well as all new fiction set in Anderson's worlds. Contributors include Robert Silverberg, Nancy Kress, Eric Flint, Terry Brooks, Jerry Purnell, and many more. That's Multiverse, exploring the worlds of Poul Anderson. Also out is the subject of today's podcast interview, the year's best military science fiction and space opera. That one, as I said, was edited by me, your host, David Afsharirad. And it's a good one if I do say so myself. Of course, the credit for that goes to the contributors, some of whom will be joining us in just a moment. The book also includes short stories by Holly Black, Brad Torgerson, Seth Dickinson, and many more. It also features an introduction by master of military science fiction, David Drake. The book collects the most thrilling, pulse-pounding, edge-of-your-seat stories of the year. Incidentally, I'd like to mention that you can get in on the action by voting for your favorite story in the anthology. Baen is proud to announce the first annual Year's Best Military Science Fiction and Space Opera Award. There's a website in the book where you can go to vote on the story from the anthology that you thought was the year's best. The winner of that proctor voting will get a $500 prize and a cool plaque, which will be handed out at DragonCon later this year. So, reward your favorite story or author by voting. And now let's talk to some of the contributors to Year's Best. Here is Matthew Johnson, Derek Kunsken, David D. Levine, Lyndon Nagata, Michael Z. Williamson, and me, David F. Shirerod, talking about the Year's Best military science fiction and space opera.
I want to welcome all of the contributors we have on today. First up, Matthew Johnson. He's the author of the novel Fall from Earth, which he describes as a feminist, Confucianist space opera. We have to pick up a copy of that. It sounds interesting. Want to know what that looks like. As well as the short story collection Irregular Verbs and Other Stories. He's had his short fiction appear in Asimov's, On Spec, Space and Time, Fantasy and Science Fiction, and quite a few other places that we don't have time to list. He was also recently reelected as Director at Large of CEFWA. Matthew, thanks for talking with us today.
My pleasure. I should mention also that I'm at a bowling alley, if anyone wonders about the noises in the background.
Just joining us from the bowling alley, Matthew Johnson.
Yeah, I'm joining from Cosmic Bowling in Ottawa.
All right, excellent. Also joining us, not from Cosmic Bowling, I assume, maybe you guys are bowling together, is Derek Kunsken. He's had work appear in Blackgate, Beneath Ceaseless Skies, On Spec, and Best Horror of the Year. He's something of a regular contributor to Asimov's. Persephone Descending, which is the story we'll be talking about here shortly, was his first publication in Analog, and Starship Sofa. By the way, that Starship Sofa podcast is up now. If you prefer your fiction to enter your brain through your ears, you can listen to it there. He's been shortlisted for the Aurora Award and has won the Asimov's Readers' Poll Award. Derek, thanks for joining us today on the podcast.
No, thanks for having me here, David. You're right. I decided not to go bowling for this podcast.
All right, very good. Also here is David D. Levine. He is the author of the novel Arabella of Mars, which will be out next year, so keep your eyes peeled for that one, as well as over 50 short science fiction and fantasy stories. He's won the Hugo Award and has been shortlisted for another Hugo, a Campbell, and a Nebula. His works appeared in Asimov's, Analog, Fantasy and Science Fiction, and 5, or I guess now 6, Year's Best anthologies, among other places. In 2010, he spent 2 weeks at a simulated Mars base in the Utah desert. David, thanks for coming down from Mars and joining us.
It's my pleasure. You'll have to put up with a 20-minute delay for my replies, though.
Right, yeah, we'll edit that out in post. All right, and Lyndon Nagata is here. It's a pleasure to talk with her again. She's a Nebula and Locus Award-winning author. Her short story, Nahiku West, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was a runner-up for the Theodore Sturgeon Memorial Award, and her novel, the military thriller The Red First Light, was a finalist for both the Campbell Award and the Nebula. She's best known for her science fiction, but she also writes fantasy. You can get a taste of that in her Scoundrel Lit series, Stories of the Puzzle Lands, or you can also find one of her fantasy stories in Operation Arcana, which came out from Bain a little while back, edited by John Joseph Adams. We did a podcast on that one. Anyways, Linda, thanks for coming back on the Bain Free Radio Hour.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. And finally, last but not least, we have Michael Z. Williamson. He's retired military, having served 25 years in the U.S. Army and U.S. Air Force. He was deployed for Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Desert Fox. He's consulted on military matters, weapons, and disaster preparedness for the Discovery Channel and the Outdoor Channel, and he's editor-at-large for the wildly popular survivalist blog, Survival Blog. With John Ringo, he is the author of the novel The Hero, and flying solo, he is the author of the books in the Freehold series, which include Freehold, Better to Beg Forgiveness, Do Unto Others, and When Diplomacy Fails. All of those are out from Bain. And incidentally, his short story Soft Casualty, which is in Year's Best, which we'll be talking about today, is also set in that Freehold universe. His new novel, A Long Time Until Now, is a military time travel survivalist thrill ride. And it came out about a week ago from Bain as well. Mike, thanks for joining us.
Thanks. I got booted offline there, but I'm back now, so let's continue.
All right, well, I'm going to just kind of go around and ask you guys some questions about your stories, rather. It was a real pleasure discovering all these. I was the editor on, I'm just going to call it Year's Best from now on, but we're talking about Year's Best Military Science Fiction and Space Opera. And just a real joy discovering these stories that you all had written, and a pleasure getting them in the anthology. Hopefully we can get some, eyes on them here. Derek, let's start with you. Your story with Persephone Descending is about Marie Claude, and she's on Venus, and there's some sabotage, and she's got to sort of use her wiles to survive the very harsh climate of Venus. One thing that drew me into the story, I mean, it's very edge of your seat. Is she going to make it? How is she going to do this? How's she going to get out of this? But I also like the way in which it was told, which is that in addition to that standard edge of your seat third person, you intersperse these different storytelling techniques using encyclopedia articles, trial transcripts, all kinds of things like that, newspaper articles. And those non-traditional methods gave the story, to me, a sense of reality, that this really happened. And while the third-person sections where we're following her, kept up the suspense, and in a way, they complement each other really well, where you build it up to a peak of tension there, and then we cut away and we get a little bit of history. And so we're left on the edge of our seat till we return back. I was just wondering how you came up with this approach and why you chose to use it when telling Persephone Descending.
Well, thanks, David. I love exploring strange places in science fiction, whether I'm reading it or writing it. But there's always a problem if you're dumping too much information in the narrative. It can be the wrong thing to do artistically. What I was thinking about when I was putting in these alternative narrative styles was, one, it would give me access to other voices so that it breaks up the sense of voice that I have and gives a bit of a different flavor. It lets me manage the pacing, too. As you mentioned, like right at the peak moment, there was a bit of a break because I wanted to draw out that tension. And at the same time, it also allows me to give more information than I might otherwise be able to give by opening the curtain for the reader onto, part of the world that I found fascinating but doesn't fit exactly into the narrative in a third-person sense. So it was a way to play with things and have a bit of a different pacing.
Yeah, and this is part of, we should say, sort of a larger world you're building. Is that correct? That this, where Quebec has broken off from Canada and has colonized Venus. Could you just kind of walk us through maybe a little bit of the history that plays into Persephone Descending in this world that you're building?
Sure. So what I posit in the story, and this is part of a cycle of stories in a future history that I'm building, but by the time Quebec does separate and become its own nation, many of the other key parts of the solar system that one might want to colonize, are already used. Or taken, let's say, and so Quebec has the option of trying to colonize Venus, which is not really a smart bet. But the thing is, there's a lot of scientific things that can be learned in Venus, and in fact, in other stories, I'll explore some of those scientific discoveries that are later on going to transform Quebec into a much larger power that I'm going to use in other stories. So that was a lot of fun to do. But I was thinking too that. My family has been Quebecois for about 250 years, and I realized as a Canadian author, what do I bring to, the table into the larger SF conversation? And, one of the things I've heard said is they say that class is to Britain what race is to the United States and what language is to Canada. And Quebec has obviously lived a generation of public discourse about its place in the world and its identity, whether it should be part of Canada, whether it should be its own country. But the debate about identity and the politics of identity are really corrosive on the social fabric. At times they need to happen, but as they go on, it can really become something a bit acidic. And as a writer and an observer of this and somebody who lives in Quebec, I realized that the acidity of Venus was something that I wanted to use as a metaphor for some of the explorations of my own reflections on those public debates that are happening in my province. And so, artistically and, my own family-wise, plus where I live, it all kind of came together and in this place, and it all made sense for the story and what I wanted to try and do and explore.
That's interesting, the acidity of Venus mirroring, acidity in a metaphorical sense. That was not something that had occurred to me, but it's very interesting and adds that layer of richness. You touched on this a little bit, but as I was reading this, I was reminded of a couple things. One, in a weird way, which I'll explain, which is one was Fargo, the Coen brothers movie, and they had talked about, not so much in tone or subject matter, obviously, but they had talked about when they had made Fargo, which they're from Minnesota, that it had almost seemed exotic to the Hollywood producers and Hollywood people, because it was this whole world they weren't familiar with, middle American, Minnesotans. And that's kind of how I felt about this, is that Quebec is not a place that I know much about or am as familiar with. Certainly, I think many Americans maybe aren't. And so this kind of had this would have been a fine story from a different perspective, but that layer of being from Quebec just added something kind of exotic to it. And the other thing that it reminded me of was the horror and mystery writer Joe Lansdale talking about how he had, what broke him out of being a good writer into, sort of really breaking in, was when he realized he could write about East Texas, where he's from, and the people that he knew in East Texas. And I just wonder, have you always written from this Quebecois, my pronunciation I'm sure is bad, but that perspective, or is that something you kind of have come to, and it seems like you really found your voice with that. I just wonder what that process was like of coming to that, writing from those experiences.
It's actually something relatively new for me. I wrote the story about 2 years ago, and before then I'd almost exclusively written about aliens, and so my other stories that appeared in Asimov's and On Spec and in other places, very little time did they actually have humans in them. So this is one of my first stories with humans in them, and I also felt when I was writing about the survival tale on Venus that it was a bit soulless, like there was something missing to it. It was a good adventure, but it lacked something. And so as soon as I thought for a second that, like, I related it to what I was reading in the news about the identity politics, the latest discourse in Quebec, it made total sense to me that, I really should be writing about where I live and bring that into it. And, I'm not going to say I'm the perfect voice to bring that out, but I mean, you're right. Nobody else is bringing out the Quebecois, although Alastair Reynolds, I think, did a bit, but not in the same way.
Yeah, and, I should also mention, while we're talking about these interesting but kind of heady ideas of identity politics and such, that this is a pretty rip-roaring tale at the same time. You're going to, like I said, you're going to be at the edge of your seat wondering if Marie Claude is going to make it. So I don't want people to think that this is a dry treatise on Canadian identity. It's definitely not dry. It's definitely an exciting story. So just want to appreciate that. And now I'm going to turn it to David D. Levine. His story is also set on Venus, but it is a very, very different kind of Venus. I think of this story as the love child of Black Mask and Amazing Stories in a way. It's set on the Venus we wanted to have, a swampy jungle world with amphibious aliens and, eternal cloud cover, rainy. And it follows the story of a detective whose name, Mike Drayton. He goes from Los Angeles. Yeah, Mike Drayton. He goes from Los Angeles to Venus on a airship. And it's just a lot of fun. And I was just wondering, David, so this is an old kind of pulp tale, and I love these kind of things, and I love this one, obviously. And I just wanted to ask you, you had a story in Gardner Dozois and George R. R. Martin's Old Mars, which is a similar kind of thing, drawing on Bradbury and Burroughs-esque tales of Mars that we, again, know doesn't really exist. And I just wondered, what are your thoughts? Why are these story is still so appealing? I mean, we know there's not froggies, aboriginals on Venus. Science fiction is supposed to be about, strictly looking forward and using real science. And yet these still have just a great appeal. There's something about them that I just really enjoy, and I really enjoyed this story, and I wondered, what is the appeal to you to writing in this sort of fantasy world of Venus that doesn't exist?
Well, this goes a long, long way back. I read an essay once, which I've never been able to track down since, called The Science Fiction Archipelago, talking about how science fiction is descended directly from the South Seas adventure tales of the 17 and 1800s. That if you look at your kind of default science fiction universe, where it's about a ship, it's about a captain. The captain has a lot of independence, probably doesn't have a lot of communication back with their superiors back on Earth. Distances between planets can be measured in months rather than seconds or weeks or years or centuries. Really, the standard science fiction universe is a universe of sea travel. And this story is actually the third story I've written in the universe of my forthcoming novel, Arabella of Mars, which started off with the basic idea of, let's just posit that we had a solar system that was just like ours, except it was full of air, so that people could go to other planets with technology of a much earlier era. So what would be the history of an Earth that was in a solar system like that? And I originally started off with the idea that this could be written as hard science fiction, but I very quickly realized that a solar system full of air would, A, not be stable. The planets, due to the friction of the air, the planets would spiral down into the sun long before life could evolve. B, air really isn't all that transparent, and so instead of a sun, if you looked up into the sky, you would just see sort of a vague red glow, if that. So again, it would be very difficult for life to evolve. And C, even with the solar system being full of air, it would take far, far too long to get anywhere. So I finally decided, okay, this isn't hard science fiction, it's actually a fantasy, and I'm going to run with it and make it as scientific as I can anyway. So starting with the idea that probably humanity would have discovered that it's possible to travel to other planets, probably in like the 16 or 1700s by balloon, that I realized that this universe gives me the ability to write not a future history, but an entire alternate history. I can write science fiction stories set on other planets in the 1600s, 1700s, anytime up to the present and into the future. And so I've been exploring this. The novel Arabella is set in 1813. I wanted to write a Regency adventure with airships. The short story in Old Mars, The Wreck of the Mars Adventure, came off of a question that one of my first readers asked me when reading Arabella, which is, how did they get to Mars in the first place? So I wrote the story of the first Englishman on Mars, who was Captain Kidd. Yes, that Captain Kidd. The one in Year's Best was I just wanted to explore something more in the 20th century. And I call it Venus Noir. This story was most directly inspired by Northwest Smith, which was a series of stories back in the 30s and 40s by, was that Sprague de Camp? There was kind of a consensus universe in the early days of science fiction that Mars was a desert with canals and Venus was a swampy jungle. And the thing is, of course, that having a solar system full of air is one thing, but actually having it interesting to visit those other planets implies that they're inhabited. And if I'm going to make it inhabited, I can't have Venus anything like the Venus that we have in our actual universe. So really, this is just, it's to make interesting stories possible that I work the universe into something more like the classic pulp universe. And so I've got a lot of other ideas set all up and down the timeline, looking into things that might happen in this universe where travel to other planets is something that's easy.
Yeah, that's great. I guess I didn't realize that all these stories tied in together. The one in Old Mars and then this one here. One of the things that you just hit on that is the appeal to me is that what you said that travel to other planets is easy, and I think that's one of the things that appealed to me is you read those old 50s, 40s science fiction tales, and we didn't really know how big and how spread out and how the universe was and how unlikely finding intelligent life was. You could get to places with intelligent civilizations with a rocket, which we know is probably not going to work. And so it kind of makes everything I don't know. It brings the scale down in a pleasing way to me to read to read this kind of tale. It's something that feels, although it's totally fantastical, kind of weirdly attainable at the same time.
I've done a lot of things in the world building here to make the whole thing more familiar. I mean, I know that aliens are unlikely to resemble giant frogs. I mean, I have basically just gone with the typical default, the stereotype for all these things. Yes, Mars is a desert. Yes, it's covered with canals. The Martians look like crabs. The Venusians look like frogs. That basically making it as much like Earth as possible. In some ways, it's a failure of imagination, but in my case, it's homage. I'm definitely doing an homage to those great old stories from the 30s and 40s, which were on my dad's shelf when I was a kid, so I grew up reading them.
Yeah, well, it definitely transports you right back there. And I think I mentioned it's kind of got a Chandler-esque, Philip Marlowe-esque main character here, detective who is called to Venus by a wealthy silk merchant to help him solve a mystery. And are you a fan? I mean, I guess obviously you're a fan of those old Black Mask detective tales. Have you written stuff like that before, or was that something you'd always wanted to write, and now you got a chance to fold it into this science fantasy universe?
This is the first time I've written something that's explicitly noir like this. I was fortunate enough to get the invitation to write this story when I was at a writers' conference with a bunch of people, including Daniel Abraham, who is a whiz at plotting. And I just brainstormed this out with him. He's given a lot of thought to noir. I actually had to do a lot of research on noir to write this one because I knew I wanted to write something noir-ish. And I was looking online, finding out, what is noir? And there's a lot of things that are inside noir that you won't necessarily know if you don't really think about it. That noir is all about honor. That the noir hero is the honorable man in a universe of dishonorable people. And you've got a tension here between honor and legality. That the noir hero will often do something that's illegal, but he will always be driven by honor. And it's always a he, almost always a he. That the noir hero is going to be driven by loyalty. The noir hero is typically driven by loyalty to their partner or their ex-partner. And love is only a complication in noir. That the real key of a noir story is loyalty and friendship between men, although there's plenty of betrayal and other things like that. But there's always going to be, in noir, there's always going to be a twist, a turn, a very complicated, often overcomplicated plot. And I tried to factor in as many of these things as I could. So I was basically very intellectually building something to hit as many of those noir notes as I could.
I think it was successful. You managed to get a lot in a short story. And what you were saying, the honor. There's that famous Chandler quote, which I will butcher at this point, where a man walks down the mean streets who is himself not mean, right, or something along those lines. And I think you definitely capture that with Mike Drayton in this story. So, all right. Well, thanks, David. I'm gonna move on here to. Let's see, who's up next? Mike Williamson. Let's talk to you. This story is, like we said, set in your Freehold universe. It's called Soft Casualty, and it was on Bain.com. It's a Bain.com story. And maybe if you could, Mike, just real briefly, for those maybe who have not read the series, if you could just give us a thumbnail sketch of what is the background to the Freehold universe.
Oh, thumbnail. Well, and each book's 175,000 words.
Yeah. Can you condense that down into 30 seconds, please? No, take as much time as you need, but just to give the people kind of, just to orient them to the world of the stories.
The UN's effectively a unified government, but there's a number of colony worlds and a number of independent systems, and basically, due to distance and economics, they're less beholden. They have their own informal alliance. And then as the universe continues, more and more of them are going independent. Freehold Organia goes, from their point of view, way off the rails, hardcore libertarian. And becomes a thorny problem, and politics breaks down. They escalate bit by bit to more violence, and slap fights never get smaller. So there's a war. The war gets resolved with a huge number of casualties, and then in the later books, they're trying to make amends and work on the same team again.
Yeah, I think that summed it up well. You did it. So I like this story a lot because I am, as much as I love science fiction, I like horror almost as much or just as much. And this, to me, had a great, that EC Comics Tales from the Crypt kind of vibe. That perfect, wryly humorous, but horrific at the same time, with some things you don't necessarily see coming. Are you a fan of that stuff, and did that factor in when you were writing this?
No, I'm not.
You're not really? Well, you nailed it.
I was looking for... it's something I discussed with a friend actually quite some time ago, and unfortunately he died before the story was written, so he never got to see the conclusion. But we were going through psyops. What can you do to completely freak out your opponent and destroy their willingness to fight? And some of them are in freehold, some are in the weapon. Depends. The targets you choose and how you choose to attack them. Give a excuse me. Give a presentation. What are you willing to do? What does the enemy think you're willing to do? If they think that nothing is safe, that there's no middle ground, there's nowhere they can go, it puts them into either a different bargaining or a different tactical position. And of course, you got to be careful of overdoing it, or not overdoing it enough, because in that case they get very mean very quickly. To destroy their willingness to fight, not drive them into a rage of disagreeability. And that was one of the ideas. It's local, it's improv, it's nothing official. It's just something some rebel decided was a workable way of scaring people.
Yeah, well, I think it would work. It's pretty. I don't know. I guess we shouldn't say what it is. You have to buy the book to figure out what it is. Well, you mentioned talking about some of the other books in the series, and I know that those are told from different perspectives, and that's one thing to me that is interesting about series, whether it's on television or a movie series or, of course, literature, is that because you've got a set world that you're working in, you are free to explore different points of view in it, right? And this is told from the point of view of the UN forces, the bad guys, really. And I know some of the other books are also told, again, from different perspectives. And I just wonder, is that something that appeals to you, and how do you go about writing that, exploring from the bad guys' perspective, writing it from their point of view? And what's that like, and do you enjoy doing that? Is that one of the pleasures you get from writing a longer series like this?
Every character has a different perspective, both in fantasy and in the real world. Everyone sees their part of the picture. Some people see a larger part of the picture, and then, of course, every individual's got their own abilities. In the military, I know people who had one relatively safe deployment, effectively out of the combat zone, and couldn't handle it, and had a mental breakdown. And then I know people who volunteered for 6, 8, or 10 rotations in combat and handled it just fine. And you can't criticize somebody who tried their best, reached the limit of what they were able to do, and did it honorably. But at the same time, they don't have the same perspective as somebody who lives for the excitement and handles it easily. So there's that. There's the civilian versus the military point of view throughout the universe. Then which culture and society were they raised in? Are they in an egalitarian society, a statist society? Are they used to a technological culture with lots of social safety? Or are they on a frontier where there is none of that? All of this plays into what happens and how they see it.
Yeah, so just using people's backgrounds as a way to explore, different perspectives on the same conflict. So let me now turn to Linda Nagata. Linda's got the distinction of she's got 2 stories in the anthology, Codename Delphi and Light and Shadow. And I want to talk about Codename Delphi first because it is actually the first story in Year's Best. And it concerns a handler named Karen Larson, and she is a sort of a remote, she controls these drones which assist with combat, and but she herself is not engaged in combat in a way. And I read a lot of drone stories, and many of them very, very good. But what this one was interesting to me is that it was not drones as we use them now, sort of remote control. Well, you know what drones are. But neither was it drones as, AIs, which I saw a lot of. This was sort of an interesting mixture where the drone pilot is assisting boots on the ground infantry. And I thought that was a very interesting idea. I wonder where that came from. And if you think, we hear so much about technology in the military and, less and less you need to put soldiers in harm's way. But here, we've got a future war where they're boots on the ground is still very much a part of it. Is that something you kind of foresee as always being part of warfare, and how did that play into writing the story?
Well, the idea behind the drones, first I should probably say that both these stories are in the same story world as my novel, The Red First Light, which is going to be re-released by Saga at the end of the month. So a lot of the technology that I'm using here came out of that novel. And with the drones, I just had in mind that they would be basically a communications and surveillance platform, that they'd be in the air all the time. And so you couldn't really load weapons on them because of the weight and the need to reload ammo and that sort of thing. So the soldiers call them angels because it's basically an angel watching over you. And it gives them extra eyes on the battlefield. They fly high enough for the sort of the conflict that they're taking part in, that they're not really vulnerable to being shot down easily. So what it is that they work as a coordinated team. So we have the handler, which is Delphi from the story title, and she oversees what the soldiers are doing. She oversees what the drone sees. And there's a lot of AI assistance that I'm imagining here, so that the drone itself is actually flown by an AI, but it's not the conscious, autonomous sort. It's just similar to Google's language recognition program. It's a learning program that can handle the details, and then the human guidance can come in and send the drone in specific directions, or they can leave it to work on its own to survey the surrounding terrain. So that's where that came from. And as to infantry continuing, I think it depends, what kind of war are you going to be fighting? If you're fighting something like the Iraq War, where you're amongst civilians and you have insurgent populations coming in and you don't know who the enemy is, but you can't do an all-out war, then I don't know how else you would do it. I guess you could. It's fun. It's interesting to kind of think about all the different ways that you could approach this, because maybe you could have autonomous robotic soldiers come in, but at the same time, how would you control them? Would jamming be an issue if you were trying to do oversight? And in the end, for me, it's just a much more interesting story if it involves human soldiers on the ground. And then you have to deal with the consequences and the moral questions.
that's the thing that was interesting to me is this story. We're at a remove in a way because we're following Delphi, Karen Larson. That's her, I guess, handle. And she is, she's not in the middle of the battle. She's sitting, safely behind a bank of monitors, and yet at the same time, because of her character and her, I guess, values or moral compass, we still care very deeply. It's at one point, you talked about how some of the handlers think of it as a video game, but she can't see it as a video game. And I thought that was just a really interesting, an interesting take. And I think the other thing about it, and this will maybe segue into Light and Shadow, your other story in the collection, and that is that you're dealing with, even though she's not in the midst of things, and there is a toll that can be taken. And I don't want to spoil anything about the story, but we see that happen in both stories. And although Codename is a little bit more of an uplifting, upbeat story, we still deal with that serious issue of the horrors of war, I guess. And so I do want to segue into Light and Shadow. And so in this one, the conceit, and I'll ask you to maybe explain this better than I can, is members of the military that wear these skull caps that essentially blunt emotion. I just wonder if you could just walk people through, sort of the central conceit of that and how that works and how maybe it doesn't work so well.
Yeah, the idea behind the skull caps is it's a neural enhancement. It's intended to give more control over a soldier's emotional state. So the idea is that there's tiny implants throughout the brain that monitor and stimulate neural activity. And this is kind of based on an idea that it may be possible that subjective experiences, thoughts and emotions, that they can be associated with specific patterns of activity in the brain. So the skull cap itself is it's a sensor that's in wireless communication with these implants that are in the brain. And it can control the activity of those implants so that it can stimulate certain emotional states or calm a soldier down or keep the soldier in a state of continuous alertness, or conversely, send the soldier into a state of sleep when it's downtime. And the skull cap's activity is overseen by an AI, and that AI is charged with keeping a balanced mental state, or at least within certain parameters, among many other things. And so what Light and Shadow touches on is that the idea that severe stress, battlefield stress, can cause long-term changes in brain chemistry. But there was a study that came out that suggested that treating this stress within a few hours of occurrence could reduce PTSD symptoms. So I kind of started from that idea. And so in Light and Shadow, what we have are the soldiers who are doing these nightly missions, infantry. And they've been wearing the skull caps for a long time. And one of them decides, for reasons that come out in the story, to stop wearing the skull cap, except for when she's absolutely required to. And what they find out is that they've become addicted to them, basically. So because the skull cap is helping to balance their brain chemistry, once they take it off, your normal brain functions have basically given up some of their control to the skull cap. So it's kind of like coming off of an addictive drug. Your emotions can go in many different directions, and that is the basis of that story.
Yeah, and I think it said a lot about soldiers returning from, you talk about when they go on leave or when their tour duty's up, you turn it in. It's military property, and how difficult it is to adjust, like you're saying. And I think that acts as a sort of metaphor, right, for what happens when you come home from war. It's a different life that you've got to adjust to. And then finally, let me turn to Matthew Johnson, story Rules of Engagement. It reminded me a lot, in a way, of Light and Shadow, although they're very different stories, but they're dealing with this, what happens after, in a way. And in addition, you've got there's implants in your story that are not dissimilar from the skull caps in Linda's story, although they work a little bit differently. Could you kind of walk us through what are these implants in Rules of Engagement? How do they work, and what's that all about?
Sure. Well, the implants in my story were actually based a little bit on what Linda was describing is happening right now, which is technologies to try to prevent or mitigate PTSD. So these are ones that essentially interact with the brain, and one of the things they do is that they give you access to all kinds of data feeds, particularly from the drones that you're working with. They give you access to a translator if you need one, things like that. And in fact, in my story, the implants are one of the reasons why people join up. It's sort of the equivalent of a GI Bill, because having one of these implants, they're expensive, but it opens up a whole lot of job opportunities. One of the characters, when he goes home, actually he's able to get a job doing traffic management because he has experience as a drone operator. So when he's got the upgraded implant, which in my story they're allowed to keep. So he goes home and he's able to use that experience and that technology to get that job. But what's central to the story, and where the title of the story comes from, is that the implants are used to provide and reinforce the rules of engagement. Because, of course, the problem always is every soldier needs to know the rules of engagement. They need to know when they're allowed to fire, when they're allowed to do what. But, of course, you don't want the enemy to know those. That can be a tremendous tactical advantage if the enemy knows them. So the idea here is that by basically negative reinforcement, a buzz that starts out just mildly irritating and gets stronger and stronger, the longer you try to go against the instructions from the implant, you're guided into following the rules of engagement. But of course, the soldiers pretty quickly find out a variety of hacks to get around the ways that the implants limit what they can do.
Yeah, you say there's three ways to do it. One is you just blunt the buzz with alcohol or drugs. The other one I like was you say you if you can convince yourself that you're not really breaking the rules, if you truly in your heart believe you're not breaking the rules, then the implant won't kick in, right? So I'm not robbing this guy. He wanted to give me his wallet, right? If you can convince yourself of that, then it won't kick in.
Yeah, you can really believe it. Yeah. We see that. We see some of that in the story. That happens. Like we see the results of a few of those cases where people, made themselves really believe something so they could go against the implant. And then there's the third one, which is where you, one of the characters in not actually in the story, but he's sort of a legend among the characters in the story, where he does everything he can to go against the implant in little ways and builds and builds and builds and builds, and then stops breaking the rules. And the idea is it's like hitting yourself with a hammer. It feels so good when you stop. So that was the way that character hacked the implant.
Yeah, I love that. I was going to ask you to explain it, so I'm glad you did. It was. This is a pretty. It's a pretty serious story, but I love that little bit of humor, in a way there. That's kind of made me smile when I read that. That was pretty funny. Kind of like with Derek's story, this is told a little bit non-standard. I don't know what that was on the phone. Kind of in a non-standard way. It's almost written like a magazine feature article, like you might see in the New Yorker or something of that nature. And I just was wondering, where that came from, why you chose that. It starts out with the quote, heading, a reporter at large. This is told from some reporter's point of view.
Yeah.
And how that came about.
That's actually, if you read the New Yorker, that's one of their categories of articles, is a reporter at large, and that basically means it's one of their investigative reporters who's found a story and chased it long enough to get an article. And that was basically what I wanted to do with it, was that I did want it to read like something from a New Yorker article from the future, where there's, like those great articles that, take you days to read and are totally absorbing, which I hope I imitated. But it's got three different time frames going on. It's got what happened to the soldiers when they were in the field, got what happened to them when they came back, and it's also got the storyline of the reporter herself investigating and finding out what happened. So every now and then she inserts herself into the story. It's one of these things where it's about 80% third person or 90% third person, and every now and then there's a first person bit that reminds you that this is actually someone telling you the story. And it's just, I guess because it was near future, I don't write a lot of near future SF, and because in some ways it's quite a political story, it made sense to me that this is how that story would be told.
Yeah, I think it worked well, and I think that three-pronged, switching back and forth, telling different stories, I think that really did work and brought a layer of complexity and sort of verisimilitude that you might not have. So I do think it felt like a New Yorker from the future to me. So, all right, well, we're kind of running out of time here. This was a great discussion. I just want to end, let's go around the metaphoric circle. We're not actually in a circle. And if you guys want to just talk about maybe a space opera or military science fiction series or movie or book that was, kind of one of your favorites that you might recommend to people. Of course, once they finish reading the year's best military science fiction and space opera, and when they're hungry for more, what can they go look for that you guys enjoy? David, what about you? What do you think? Space opera, military science fiction, worth taking a look at?
Well, I can recommend the Bolo series by Keith Wammer. I'm very fond of the stories of Ian Banks, which could be classed as space opera. And I think probably the best space opera in the visual in the visual medium is the first Star Wars movie, the one that was later retitled A New Hope.
Yeah, not Episode 1.
Yes, no,
number 4, which was first, versus number 1, which was fourth.
Right, exactly. Mike, what about you? Besides the Freehold series, which everyone should read, what else you got?
I was a huge fan of, well, I still am, of the stuff Heinlein did, Moon Harsh Mistress, Starship Troopers. I actually read both of those right after I finished Basic. Joe Haldeman's Forever War gives a fascinating counter view of a drafty enlistee versus a career academy officer, and the differing politics between the someone raised in the 30s and someone raised in the 60s and 70s, and then a lot of Purnell stuff for the political background behind the fighting. There's a whole bunch out there, and of course Drake's Hammer Slammers universe is gritty, and I mean that's horrifying on its by itself. There's no punches pulled. It's war is brutal, and you want to stay out of it as much as possible. So all of those were informative. They're still stuff I read and enjoy. And then my experience is I'm a veteran, an immigrant. I had a career mindset, but circumstances forced me into the reserves for a large chunk of it. But I pulled a lot of additional duty time. And there's so much military SF out there. I'd have to go look at my library.
Yeah, sure. Well, you definitely hit on some classics there that everyone should be reading if they haven't already. Linda, what do you got? Space opera or military SF? Do you want to recommend?
I'm going to go pretty far back too, and I'm going to say Greg Benford's Great Sky River, and the follow-up with Across the Sea of Suns. And it's a far future story in a story world where there is no faster than light travel. And humans have spread across the galaxy, but they've also run into a mech race. And basically we've been nearly wiped out. So Great Sky River starts on a planet where there are just a few surviving humans who live in a military formation as they try to figure out what to do to avoid extinction. And it was a very influential novel on me. It's exactly the sort of thing that I enjoy reading. So again, it's Great Sky River by Greg Benford.
All right. And Matthew, what do you think? What do you got?
Well, I'm going to recommend a book. I'm going last, so I have to dig into the obscure stuff. But I'm going to recommend a book that's out of print, and for legal reasons, unfortunately, is likely to remain so. But if you're someone who likes to dig through the shelves at used bookstores, I recommend keeping an eye out for this one. It's called Princes of the Air by John M. Ford. And I don't know if it's Ford's best book, but it's certainly one of my favorite space operas. And what I love about it is that it takes basically the classical Newtonian system of something like Foundation, and it applies chaos theory to it. And it's also just a tremendously rich and clever and funny milieu with really interesting characters and really human characters, which can be hard to do in space opera.
Yeah, okay, great. So that'll give someone some homework to track down a used copy of that then. Appreciate you digging back into the archives. Well, we've been talking about the year's best military science fiction and space opera, which is out now from Baen. I want to thank everybody, Derek, David, Michael, Linda, and Matthew for being here. And I also want to thank the other contributors. We would have loved to have everybody on, but unfortunately, time constraints and logistics wouldn't allow for that. But I just want to thank everyone again just for being here and discussing the stories and for writing such great stories to begin with. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David.
And now we begin the complete serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky, read by Tristan Morris. As always, this audiobook presentation is made possible by Audible.com. John Ringo is the creator of the New York Times best-selling Post-Lean War series, which includes the novel A Hymn Before Battle, Gustfront, When the Devil Dances, Hell's Fair, and Eye of the Storm. He's also the author of the nationally best-selling techno-thriller novels about Mike Harmon. A more playful twist on the future is found in novels of the Looking Glass series, Into the Looking Glass, Vorpal Blade, Manxome Foe, and Claws That Catch, the last three in collaboration with Travis S. Taylor. With David Weber, he's the author of March Upcountry, March to the Sea, March to the Stars, and We Few. He just wrapped up his Black Tide Rising series, which is about a worldwide zombie outbreak and the rugged can-do men and women who aren't willing to leave the world to the infected. The first entry in that series is Under a Graveyard Sky, and we're pleased to present the first entry in our complete serialization of that novel now.
Audible Inc. presents Under a Graveyard Sky, written by John Ringo, narrated by Tristan Morris. Book 1. Light a Candle. At the end of the river, the sundown beams, all the relics of a life long lived. Here, weary traveler, rest your wand. Sleep the journey from your eyes. From Turn Loose the Mermaids, Night Wish, Imaginarium. Chapter 1. Alas, Babylon Q4E9, the text read. Bloody hell. And it really hadn't started out as a bad day. Weather was crappy, but at least it was Friday. Stephen John Professor Smith was 6'1", with sandy blonde hair and a thin, wiry frame. Most people who hadn't seen him in combat, and very few living had, considered him almost intensely laid back, which in general was the case. It came with the background. Once you'd been dropped in the dunny, few things not of equal difficulty were worth getting upset about. Until, possibly, now. He regarded the text from his brother and wondered if this was how morning walkers on 9/11 felt. He knew the basic code. Alas, Babylon was a book about a nuclear war in the 1950s. And Survivors in the Aftermath. The novel by Pat Frank was still one of the best looks at post-apocalyptic life ever written. And he and Tom had agreed that it was the best choice for a code indicating a real, this is no shit, general emergency. Not, I've got cancer, but grab the bug-out bag and activate your zombie plan, which was why he wondered if this was the same feeling those morning New Yorkers had felt looking up at the gush of fire from the side of the Twin Towers. Disbelief, sadness, even anger. His mouth was dry, palms clammy. His sphincter was doing the bit where it was simultaneously trying to press neutronium and let go all over his seat. He felt all the cycles of grief go through him in one brief and nasty blast. Tom was not a guy to joke about the end of the world. Something had hit, something or another. Despite knowing it had gone tits up, he hit reply. Confirm. The return message was immediate. Confirm, confirm, confirm. Q4E9. Confirm. Shit. The rest of the codes were the problem. Stacy and Tom were the crypto geeks. Of course, calling Tom a geek was a stretch. Nearly 2 meters tall and a former Australian SAS commando. The general manager for security and emergency response for the Bank of the Americas might have a background in crypto and enjoy the occasional alternative clubbing night. Geek was still a stretch. Tom's penchant for code, however, was part of that geeky side. While the games growing up had been a pain in the ass, Steve recognized them as a necessity in this case. Tom had come into possession of information that was still closely held. His text was a violation of not only his employment contracts, but, probably, federal law. He wasn't going to send asteroid inbound over an open network. Stacy would know what the code meant in a second. Despite his para-nickname of Professor, Steve was unfazed by both his wife and his brother being smarter than he. He was laid back and preferred to be surrounded by people who were smarter, more effective, and more dangerous. Made his life a whole lot simpler. He looked up at the class full of teenagers working on their Friday afternoon history test. Byzantine emperors were about the last of his problems at the moment. He still wasn't sure about the codes, but he knew that he'd never see most of them again. Dead or alive, his life and theirs was about to change. He was going to miss some of them, but the protocols were clear. It was much the same as being a spy, really. If you'd been burned, you didn't hesitate. When the world was ending, you didn't worry about anything but the most basic issues, notably Stacy, Sophia, and Faith, in no particular order, that he desperately hoped, whatever this was, might test. Okay, even Stacy would agree, Sophia and Faith first, just in no particular order. He therefore calmly bent over, picked up his backpack, and stood up to leave. Mr. Smith, Chad Walker said, looking at him quizzically. Just going out for a bit, Steve said. Chad was one of the good ones. Most of the kids were good for values of good. As good as American kids got, anyway. Coddled, yes, but bright by and large. Most didn't apply themselves, and the parents were mostly a pain in the ass. But it had been a good job. Past tense. He walked down the mostly silent halls in a bit of a daze. At one level, it was senseless. Nobody walked out of a job they'd done for 10 years without a wrench, and on the basis of 2 text messages. But it was what you did, if you'd prepared. You just walked away. He stopped outside the school's office and tried to assume an expression suitable for a distraught husband. Janice, he said, stepping into the office and brushing at his eyes. Stacy's been in an accident at the plant. They're taking her to the office. I need to pull Sophia out of class. Oh my God, the heavy-set brunette said, her eyes wide. What happened? Unclear, Steve said. I'll call you from the hospital. Just please page for her to be brought up here while I talk with Mr. Navas. Okay, Janice said, fumbling at the intercom. The woman really was someone Steve was looking forward to leaving behind. He knocked on the principal's door and opened it without waiting for a reply. "Steve?" Mr. Navas said, cocking a quizzical eyebrow. Alvaro Navas was a decent assistant principal, all things considered. Another person among many Steve figured he'd never see again. However, it worked out. "Stacy's being taken to the hospital," he said, somewhat shakenly. "Injured, at work. It sounded quite serious. That guarded, we're sure it's going to be fine from HR, which means it's not. I'm pulling Sophia out to go with me to the hospital, and I'd appreciate if you'd call Angleton Middle and have them bring up Faith so I can pick her up on the way by." "Of course, Steve," Alvaro said. "Anything we can do." "I'll call you as soon as I know what's going on," Steve said. "I think Janice is bringing up Sophia." "So no idea what happened?" Navas asked. "They wouldn't say," Steve said, shrugging his shoulders helplessly. I need to go check on Sophia." Of course, Steve," Navas said, getting out of his chair. "Whatever you need. If you need some time—" "Well, it's the weekend, fortunately," Steve said. "I'll know more when I get to the hospital." "Which hospital?" Navas asked. "Not even sure of that at this point," Steve said. "Mercy, I assume. It's the closest. I've got to call back about that. I've got this handled. I'll get to you about what's going on." "Call me at home if it's after work," Mr. Navas said, patting him on the back. "Dad?" Sophia asked, her eyes wide. The 15-year-old had gotten her father's looks and her mother's height. It wasn't a bad combination. With sandy blonde hair and 5'5", she seemed to have stopped growing up, or out. "What's up?" She had her backpack over her back. If she had anything left in the locker, it was going to have to stay there. "Your mum," Steve said, then paused. "We'll talk about it in the car." "What happened to Mom?" Sophia said. "We'll talk in the car," Steve said, taking her arm. "She was injured at the plant. Mr. Navas, if you could call the middle school." "Of course," Mr. Navas said. "And call me." "I will," Steve said. "Oh, release slip." "Oh," Janice said, fumbling with the papers piled on her desk. "I've got it," Mr. Navas said, trying not to sigh. He pulled the form pad out from under a pile and quickly scribbled the necessities. "There." "Thank you, sir," Steve said. "Good luck." "Thank you," Mr. Navas said, frowning slightly. "I think I should be wishing you that." Yes, Steve said, gesturing for Sophia to precede him through the door. "Dad?" Sophia said. "In the car," Steve said, as they walked out of the building. It was a thin, nasty rain, cold for late spring, even in Virginia, which just fit his mood to a T. His car was most of the way across the teacher's parking lot, so he continued. "Don't stop moving when I say this. It's not your mother. Apocalypse code from your Uncle Tom." "What?" Sophia said, stopping and starting to turn. "I said keep walking," Steve said, grabbing her arm. "Which is why you're going to drive. I need both ends free." "You pulled me out of a test for some code from Uncle Tom?" Sophia said, angrily. "What about the dance tonight?" "By 8 p.m. we're going to be in full bug-out mode," Steve said. "This is not a drill, Soph." "I'll still need to check the codes, but it's an apocalypse code. As in, end of the world." "What end?" Sophia said, gesturing around. There certainly didn't seem to be any major issues. Cars continued speeding past the school. None of them seemed in any more hurry than they ever were. "Missing the dance is going to be the end of the world." "Not time for drama, miss," Steve said, getting in the passenger side. "Drive." "Okay," the 15-year-old said nervously. "You want me to drive in an apocalypse?" "The apocalypse isn't here yet," Steve said, pulling out his phone again. "Now be quiet. Head to Faith School." "Dad, this is crazy," Sophia said, starting the car. "Just drive," Steve said. "No music and no talking." "Hello? This is Steve Smith, Stacy Smith's husband. Our daughter, Sophia." He let a little check enter his voice. "She's been hit by a car in the school parking lot. I really need to talk to Stacy immediately." "Yes, I understand." "I got hit by a car?" Sophia whispered. Steve waved his hand at her angrily, then nodded. Stacy, alas, 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 Sophia has been struck by a car in the parking lot, he said, robotically. I'm picking up Faith right now. Yes, I'll meet you at home. Then we'll go to the hospital. You have your phone again? I'm forwarding you a text. Okay. Call me when you're on the way. He hung up the phone, then pulled up a file. What was the robot voice about? Sophia asked, pulling carefully into traffic. False information versus true, Steve said. I mean, you could have really been hit by a car. The ALAS code told her it was a real-world emergency, but not the one that I was conveying. Mom is going to be that pissed, you know, Sophia said. Part of our bargain was that if something hit the dunny, she'd go with it, Steve said, looking at a file. Oh, bloody hell. What? Sophia asked. Just concentrate on getting us to the middle school intact, Steve said, consulting his smartphone. He pulled up an app and punched in certain parameters. On the third hit, he'd found what he was looking for and dialed a phone number. Hello? My name is Jason Ransold with the Aurelius Corporation. We need to rent a boat matching the parameters of one you have for sale. Is there any way that we can get a 2-week lease? No? We'd consider buying it if we could talk about the price. And I'd need to look it over. Would Saturday afternoon work for you? This is a snap kick for a major client. Of course. 3 would work perfectly. Thank you. I'll meet you there. Sailboat? Sophia said. That's full up bug out for a biological emergency. I finally got to pull up the code sheet, Steve said. Biological, viral, latent, wide release, previously undetected, currently no vaccine, hostile activities parameter. I got all that except latent and hostile. Wait. Zombies? Something similar, Steve said, as they pulled up to the fortunately close middle school. Cell phone. Dad, cell, Steve said, pulling a burn phone out of the bag. This is your new one. Only the numbers on contact list. I have friends who... No, Steve said. You know why. I walked away from several people I like to maintain your uncle's cover. If it gets out... Uncle Tom loses his position, Sophia said, pulling out her phone and handing it over. And any support he can give us. But Brad Turner is going to have to take his chances, Steve said, taking the phone, then pocketing the burn phone. You get this when I get back. Thanks for all the trust, Dad, Sophia said, crossing her arms. I'm going to be trusting you to keep us all alive, Steve said, then handed over the phone. I guess that starts now. Prove you deserve it by not using it. Okay, Sophia said. Emergency conditions, Steve said. Yes, sir, Sophia said, then shrugged. I'll believe zombies when I see one. Despite the fact that I've just burned my job and your mother's, let's hope this is a false alarm, Steve said, getting out of the truck. What happened to Mom? Faith blurted the minute he walked into the school's office. Still not sure, Steve said. Can I get a release slip? What do you mean you don't know? Faith practically shouted. The 13-year-old had gotten her dad's height and her mother's looks, which honestly was a bit of a challenge for her older sister, whom she already overtopped. Another inheritance was her mother's temper, but twice as passionate. In a guy, the term aggressive would be more commonly used. She also had something like male muscle density, and pain tolerance a Delta would appreciate. She only played soccer because there wasn't a rugby team. On the rare trips to visit her Aussie grandparents, she positively delighted in Australian rules football. Although she just as passionately hated Rule 1, no weapons. Kintronics HR would only say she'd been injured, Steve said, taking the release form and signing for his daughter. On the other hand, the person I was talking to was pretty shaken up, so it's serious. Well then, let's roll, Faith said, snatching up her bag and darting out of the door. Goodbye, Steve said, waving as he went out the door. Apocalypse code from Uncle Tom, Sophia said as soon as Faith was in the car. Not a drill. Dad's already arranged the boat to steal. So, wait, Faith said. Mom's not... She's on her way home, Steve said, gesturing for Sophia to get in the passenger seat and climbing in the truck. We're in bug-out mode, and with any luck at all, we won't have to steal it. But what about... Faith started to ask. Phone, Sophia said, holding out a burn phone to her. Yours. You're serious? Zombies, Sophia said. No way, Faith said. We're not having a ZA. Where are the wrecked cars? The screaming people? Nobody's rising from the grave. False alarm. I've got a confirm from Uncle Tom, Steve said, pulling out of the parking lot. Parents were already forming up to pick up their precious snowflakes. Viral, not mystical. Zombie-like actions. Previously undetected. Pull the batteries. Already done on mine, Sophia said, pulling out Faith's. Okay, now it's done. Code indicates it's already spread, Steve said. So we could already have it? Sophia asked. That's not good. That's all we've got right now, Steve said. We'll get the rest as things go on. This had better be for real or I'm disowning this stupid family, Faith said, leaning back with her arms crossed and her head set. Put on your safety belt, Steve said. Safety just got much more important. If I had your phone, I could be checking for indications, Sophia pointed out. Steve considered that for a moment. The original plans hadn't included either daughters capable of information gathering or smartphones. The first requirement was gather the clan. Second was go off-grid. Going off-grid wasn't strictly necessary, but it reduced distractions. And Tom had the number for his backup, just as Steve had Tom's. Third was gather material. Then bug out. Only last, look for indicators. Among other things, indicators were a way to track information security. Not on the phone, Steve said. If Tom's usage is being monitored, it could give away his tip if you search for zombie or plague off my phone. Just work the plan. Yes, my bug-out bag is packed, Faith said and grimaced. Where's your bug-out bag? Is your bug-out bag packed? What's your inventory? Why did I get the insane parents? We're packing the trailer, Sophia pointed out. When do we go to Biocon? I'm torn, Steve admitted. We can't meet about the sailboat with masks on. On the other hand, any meeting is a danger. Speaking of which, Sophia said, dipping into her bag, hand sanitizer. She rubbed some on her hands, then passed it over. Which is why I have you along, Steve said, smiling. He wiped not only his hands, but the steering wheel. This had better be for real, Faith said, rubbing her hands vigorously. You just want to fight zombies, Sophia said. Which is why I have you along, Steve added with a grin. Derp, Faith said. Of course I want to fight zombies. Who doesn't? Me? Sophia said. Me, Steve said. Yeah, well, there had better be zombies, or I'm shooting somebody, and two guesses who. Oh, wait, they're both right. I read the code, but I'm still not 100% on this. Note that I just threw away a perfectly good job. Stacy Smith was 5'6", with dark blue eyes and dark brown, or occasionally auburn hair. 2 children had caused her to chunk a bit, but she still was pretty much the attractive geek girl Tom had met in Melbourne 18 years ago. One who agreed that the world was occasionally a hostile place and did not so much indulge her husband's penchant for preparation as drive it. I knew this day might come, Steve said, shrugging. Tom wouldn't jest about something like this. I'm going to go look for a confirm, Stacy said. Just, Steve said, grimacing. I'll use a proxy, Stacy said, patting him on the arm. I'm not going to go shouting zombie apocalypse to the rooftops. And I'll go take care of packing the trolley. Steve considered most preppers to be short-sighted, at least those portrayed in the media, and even those on the various boards. Having all sorts of preparations in an urban setting was a good way to have them taken away at the first hint of trouble. If the government didn't gather what you had or had produced, then gangs would eventually. And those that moved to distant zones, well, if the end didn't come, you had better enjoy the rural life and good luck finding a decent job in the meantime. Prepping, or survivalism, is about Maslow's hierarchies. The first three are ostensibly food, clothing, and shelter. What Maslow left out was security. And in a real, serious end of civilization as we know it, security was the single greatest concern. So Steve and Stacy's plans were flexible. The house they lived in was subtly fortified. Most of it had to do with living in Virginia, where the threat of an occasional hurricane or severe storm meant having plywood ready to cover the windows was just good sense. The house had been chosen for various real-world factors: jobs, schools, the neighborhood. But it also had fieldstone walls, which meant it was somewhat bullet-resistant. Also hurricane-resistant, which was the point that they had tended to make to casual friends or neighbors. There was a sizable and quite dry basement. There was a generator, ROWPU water purifier, and various supplies against both hurricanes and ice storms. Their neighbors were always commenting on how well prepared they were for emergencies. Which was nice until the second or third minor emergency, when you were the only one who noticed that the lights did occasionally go out, and grocery stores tended to run short when there was the slightest news of a possible disaster. Yes, we have spare toilet paper. Incoming comment, landward ho. They had some true friends, including a few Army paras and special operations Steve had met in Afghanistan and kept in touch with. Together with Tom, the group had bought an old house in the Western Virginia countryside. More or less a timeshare, they used it as a weekend or summer getaway, its actual purpose being, well, a getaway, staffed by 6 former soldiers and their generally well-prepared families. It was going to be a bit of a tough nut to crack, but there were a few events that called for heading seaward. The first was any sort of biological. Boats were designed to take stores, and modern boats had water purifiers to draw fresh water from the sea. Once they were loaded up, you could stay away from other people for a long time. Longer if you had a sailboat with green recovering power, such as wind generators and recovering propeller generators. A little fishing, plenty of vitamins, and barring running into a bad storm, you were good for months. And missing storms was mostly a matter of being where they didn't go. Assuming the biological was bad enough, afterwards you could probably scavenge with care. Thus, the full hazmat clothing in the stores. Zombies had been generally considered one of those stochastic, low probabilities that were more for fun than serious consideration. A zombie shoot was particularly fun, but because it was the sort of thing that the kids could get into, with some humor, that had been part of the planning as well. If for no other reason, then it gave them a chance to take a prepper cruise to the islands on a sailboat. The kids had enjoyed the time in the Abacos and learned the basics of sailing, as well as maintaining a boat. Survivalism. Good, clean fun for the whole family. At least if you didn't take it to excess. "The cans go on the bottom," Sophia shouted as Steve entered the basement garage. "Heavy stuff down and forward." "Bite me, Soph," Faith snarled. "I wasn't the one who already loaded the toilet paper." "Then move it around," Steve said. "Good, clean fun." "Soph, into the trolley. You load, Faith and I will toss." "Yeah," Faith said, grinning maliciously. "'Cause you're so short you can fit inside." "We shall soon be armed, sister dear," Sophia said sweetly. "That assumes you can hit me at the range of sitting next to you," Faith said, staggering over under the weight of 3 cases of water. "Which you know I can do at any range you'd care to name," Sophia replied. "She's got you there," Steve said. "She's a better shot, and you know it." "Not at combat shooting," Faith argued. "She's better when she takes all day to pull the trigger." "I'm going to have all day to listen to your bitching," Sophia pointed out. The trailer was a 10x6, bought used and improved and maintained by Stacy. She tended to do the mechanical and electrical bits. In this case, new plywood floor, new bearings, wiring, and a new coat of paint. $100 used. A bit more in repairs, and it was practically a brand new trailer, which was rapidly filling with gear and supplies. "We couldn't load the gen by ourselves," Sophia pointed out. "And if we're going to, we'd better soon, or it will unbalance the trailer. We're not taking it, Steve said regretfully. The generator wasn't new, but it was in good shape, and with care, which Stacy was obsessive about, would last for years. The boat has one. Spare? Faith asked. Rather take more supplies, Steve said, tossing a case of bottled water into the back of the trailer. The way to avoid loading the heavy on light is to move heavy first. What about ammo? Stacy asked. Ammo, guns, first aid, 1 case water, 1 general case mountain house in the car, Steve said. Bug-out bags and webbing. Hook in. We're on short time. No, it's bad, Faith said, grinning. Da's going DU then. Hooking in, Dad, Sophia said, then paused. Dad, are we really sure? No, Steve admitted, tossing a case of rations into the trailer. Not until we have a confirm, or I can talk to Tom in the open. I don't want all my friends to die, Faith said softly. I don't want either of you to die, Steve said, which is why we're hooking in. And there's a partial confirm, Stacy said, walking down the stairs. There have been 3 reported incidents on the West Coast. People are putting it down to drugs, but it's zombieistic. The bath salts thing again? Faith asked. That's it? No, Steve said. That's a confirm. Tom's message indicated that it's already out there. Those are infected people, presumably. We'll get a solid confirmation later. I'm hoping that guy makes the meeting tomorrow. Then you'd better get upstairs and call him, Stacy pointed out. He's probably getting ready to close up shop. Boat broker, Steve pointed out. He's connected to his cell. But, yeah.
That was the first entry in our ongoing serialization of John Ringo's Under a Graveyard Sky. Be sure to tune in next week for the next installment. That's it for this week's edition of the Bane Free Radio Hour. Thanks again to Audible.com and podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And thanks to Matthew Johnson, Derek Kunsken, David D. Levine, Linda Nagata, and Michael Z. Williamson for talking with us today. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of fantasy and science fiction, and keep reaching for the stars.